thank you very much for making it here for our session, which is on countering the growing threat of antibiotic resistance. My name is Claire Dool, and I'm your moderator. And as you most probably know, every year 1.3 million people die of drug-resistant infections, and that's more than HIV, it's more than AIDS or malaria. And according to the WHO, this is really one of the world's biggest public health threats. Known as a silent epidemic, but if we don't act, if it goes unchecked, then we're just not going to be able to treat some common illnesses like pneumonia or infections in newborns or in bacterial secondary infections caused by viruses. So just like COVID, drug-resistant bacteria can hit anyone at any age in any country, as this video shows.
Antibiotics are the foundation of modern medicine. They have protected us against harmful bacteria and extended life expectancy by 23 years. But their power is running out. Antibiotics have been used so extensively that many are losing their ability to fight bacteria. No one is immune. Drug resistance is a global health crisis, and it's happening now. Dr. Kruger doesn't have the right antibiotics to treat her patients. Melissa, a healthcare worker, is alarmed by the spread of supergonorrhea. Nurse Judith knows that standard treatments for sepsis are failing. Every day, life is on the line. Effective antibiotics save lives. Oram could not have survived without them. They saved Astrid's life during childbirth. Hilary knows that antibiotics are key to cancer care. Everyone has a part to play. Researchers, scientists, industry, civil society, communities, governments, policymakers. GARDP is committed to driving progress in antibiotic research and development. Together, we can help develop new treatments for drug-resistant infections and make sure that they are accessible to everyone. Join us.
So, a very powerful video, and that video is part of a campaign. And Dominique DeSantis there is the head of communications for GARDP and is going to tell us a little bit about the campaign.
Thanks a lot, Claire. So thanks everybody for coming. I think most of you know by now that antibiotic resistance is a growing public health threat, so I don't need to tell you that. But the reality is that there is no face for AMR. The drug-resistant infections is a pandemic that affects men, women, children, and newborns. So there is no one face. So what we're trying to do through this Power of Antibiotics campaign is to really show the diversity of faces and people who are really on the front lines of antibiotic resistance around the world. And we're privileged to have Hilary Thomas here, who will share her story shortly. And when you have a chance after the event to take a look, these are some of the other banners that we've included in the campaign, as well as on the roll-ups here. So I just wanted to say, yeah, we've launched the campaign last week on our Power of Antibiotics website. We've already received a few stories, actually, one from a nurse in Syria, one from a man in war-torn Ukraine, talking about the lack of access and how he's seeing his friends dying of bacterial infections because of the unsanitary conditions in Ukraine. So check out powerofantibiotics.org. I think together we can create a community to really show the various faces of AMR. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominique. So Please do use that hashtag, Power of Antibiotics, and I'm sure you'll hear some great insights from our speakers who I'll introduce in a moment, and use that for your social media posts. We're also going to be giving quite a lot of time to you to ask questions. We're going to be hearing more from GARDP in a moment because we have the Executive Director, Dr. Manica Balasegaram, who's going to be telling us about what GARDP is doing to promote research and development, and also that very important issue of access. We have Alexandra Cameron, Senior Expert, Innovation and Impact Initiatives in the AMR division at WHO, and who will also be talking to us about the state of that antibiotic pipeline and the access challenge. But somebody who Dominique has already mentioned and you saw in that video, I'm delighted is with us, Dr. Hilary Thomas, a cancer survivor and oncologist who for many years has worked with the British National Health Service and the Trusts, and who is now a Chief Medical Advisor and Partner at PA Consulting, a life sciences and healthcare consulting firm. So we're going to start with Hilary, really. A little bit about your bad news that you got when you realized that you had breast cancer. You're an oncologist, you understand it, but soon you began to realize that, of course, there was a link to drug-resistant infections. So please, tell us a little bit about this.
Thank you, Claire. So I guess I should start by saying that becoming a cancer patient was a really big shock to me. I was in my mid-40s. But actually what drew me to oncology was the fact that an awful lot of my relatives had had cancer. So I don't really know why it was such a shock, but I guess subconsciously I thought that spending my career in oncology would be some sort of insurance policy. So it came as a shock, but because I was in the trade, as it were, I found a lump on Monday night because a friend rang to say, can I come to the funeral next week of Anne? Anne was in her early 40s and had two twin daughters who'd been at school with my daughter. And that was what alerted me to examine myself, found a lump, tried to convince the GP the next day that there was something there, was diagnosed less than 48 hours after I found it, which when you look at waiting times in the NHS at the moment is quite alarming, and then had the longest week of my life wondering, would I see my kids grow up? Was I going to be node positive? You know, what was this all going to turn out to be? And about 10 days later found out I was happily node negative. But because I was in the trade again, I was given, if you like, the chemotherapy that was the standard of care at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, not the standard of care in the NHS at the time, which meant accelerating the chemotherapy. So I had chemo every 2 weeks instead of the usual 3 weeks, and to actually be able to tolerate that, had to have granulocyte colony stimulating factor injections. Now, that gives you some idea that obviously there's a correlation between the intensity of chemotherapy you can give and the benefits of it. If you undertreat people with chemotherapy, then you might as well not bother, because you don't get the same survival benefits and you won't get the outcomes that you see in clinical trials. But of course, if you overtreat people, then you knock back their immune system, you denude their white cells, and you put them at risk of infection. And so actually all oncologists at some point in their career will probably lose patients from overwhelming infection. And I can still remember those cases where I lost the patient, particularly if the patient was potentially curable and you were giving adjuvant chemotherapy. And it was that experience of becoming a patient that made me realize that actually you don't know what your patients are experiencing until you're there, until you're actually facing your own mortality, and you're actually realizing how awful the side effects are. You know, give this stuff out every week to tens of patients, and then suddenly you're dealing with day after day after day of nausea, or hair loss, or losing your eyebrows and your eyelashes, you know, just horrible stuff. And you suddenly think, actually, I have enormous respect for my patients. But you also realize that you perhaps weren't educating them about the potential dangers of their white cell counts dropping and having non-specific symptoms which you didn't pick up, and then by the time they get in touch, they've got overwhelming sepsis. So having antibiotics that are effective to enable patients to have that treatment is really important. And as I I moved away from oncology after the personal experience towards sort of more management roles and then ultimately into consulting. But I then started to become very aware of the risks of not having effective antibiotics, and was involved in some work in my previous organisation on the impact on global GDP. Jim O'Neill, who led the campaign on behalf of David Cameron, wanted to understand, and a figure of $50 trillion per year by 2050 is an enormous sum of money, and nobody quite believed Yale Selfin, our chief economist, and me. There's a range. Obviously, the figure could be lower than that; it could be higher, but it's of that order. It's an enormous amount of money, and as you say, this doesn't have a face. There isn't public awareness. People go to the doctor and expect an antibiotic because they've got a chest infection. They don't wait to know what was the bug and what was the profile of antibiotics that will effectively treat it. And when my mother developed early Alzheimer's and started to have episodes of confusion, it was nearly always attributed to a urinary tract infection, and yet on no occasion did we ever prove the urinary tract infection or know what the antibiotic sensitivity of that UTI was. So I think this public awareness, this awareness of the importance of safeguarding antibiotics so that we have them there when we need them, and what my fellow speakers are going to talk about is actually how do we continue to have new antibiotics coming along and stay ahead of the game because of this growing number of people actually dying unnecessarily from antimicrobial resistance.
Thank you for that story. You touched on there your mother's case. It must be a doctor's dilemma of you get this big pressure for antibiotics, but if you overprescribe them, you have the resistance that grows. Do you think that message is just not getting out there, even in somewhere like the UK?
I think that's right. I think the expectation of having something, and then the pressure on GP's time to sit down and explain we're not giving an antibiotic. I heard of one GP practice that was giving people chicken soup, or sachets of chicken soup, because they knew it was a viral infection and they wanted the patient to understand, therefore I'm not giving an antibiotic. So I think, yes, raising the profile of that will only help public awareness, and it's really important. I had the privilege in my day job to see some work being for the UK Health Security Agency recently, working with Southampton University to look at and I'm sure there are many other schemes like that, but to look at sensitivities rapidly so that you find out very quickly, A, is there a bacterium, and secondly, is it sensitive? And I think that we need to educate the public and take them with us on that journey and that thinking.
And I think, as you said, you were, of course, in the trade, and it was a shock to you. But being in the trade, you were very concerned at one point that you might get an infection like sepsis. And I read somewhere, not sure whether this is the right statistic, that sepsis, bloodstream infection, is associated with 8.5% of all cancer deaths. I mean, people just wouldn't know that, this link.
I think that's quite likely, yes.
Yeah. Manica, any response to what you just heard?
Thank you. No, I think it's not an unusual story, and obviously it's quite heartrending to hear your story. And I think most doctors eventually realize one day they're all going to get sick, but of course it's a shock when it happens to you. And I think the problem, of course, is that you overanalyze all the possibilities and negative scenarios, but those things are real, and I think certainly the need of why we how integrated antibiotics is to healthcare today is something that I think we forget. So I've worked in many different healthcare settings in different parts of the world, and in a way I was very lucky to have that experience in my career. But one thing that was very consistent all the way through was how we were using antibiotics. And yes, there is an element of misuse, but I also want everybody here to go away with a very positive message that antibiotics have made such a massive positive impact in healthcare settings. And I would actually argue that in where you have weaker healthcare systems, that power of the antibiotics even more enhanced, and you rely even more on these kind of tools that can be absolutely vital and life-saving. And I think that's an important dimension of why the access component really matters, particularly in countries that do have a high burden of infectious diseases and do have a high burden of MDR infections or multi-drug drug-resistant infections.
And we'll talk about access. First of all, though, this research and development pipeline. Ali, I know that the WHO was involved in a progress report for the health ministers, the G7 in Japan, and we're looking at this antibiotic research and development pipeline. Some people say it's broken. What's your analysis, and why would that happen?
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks so much. Thanks so much for including me on the panel. WHO is monitoring the pipeline actually on an annual basis, and what was done for the G7 finance and health ministers was a progress report with the AMR R&D hub, which picked up on the results of the last pipeline analysis, and also showed some of the progress that's being made towards addressing some of these, what we are calling now the access and R&D crisis. But I think that I'm probably preaching to the choir with this audience when I'm saying that the current pipeline we know is insufficient to address the growing threat of AMR, and particularly when we're looking at innovative products, so products that are really able to overcome existing mechanisms of drug resistance. We go from a pipeline that is already thin to something that is much smaller. So to give you an example, since 2017, there have been 12 new antibiotics that have reached the market, but only 2 that are considered truly innovative by WHO criteria. And similarly, for clinical development, today we have 27 products in the pipeline, but only 6 that are considered to be fulfilling this innovation criteria. So we have some major gaps, and other gaps that I could call on as well is pediatric formulations, as well as oral products that are really important for outpatient treatment and also as a step-down therapy from IV as well. So we really don't have everything that we need in the pipeline today to address this threat. We're quite a ways away still.
Because big pharma sees no commercial return, and the small biotechs struggle
I mean, there are a number of reasons, but certainly the lack of a market incentive is one of the main fundamental reasons why we see this happening today. Because these products largely are meant to be reserve products of last resort. We want to keep them for when we really need them. That really limits the return on investment by companies. And then, there is insufficient return on investment compared to the huge investments that are needed in the R&D pipeline to actually see these products through to marketing authorization.
Manica, you work with some of these biotech. GARDP, you've got the ambition, haven't you, of 5 treatments by 2025. You're filling that innovative pipeline. Tell us a little bit about where you are on that journey.
So could we just put up a slide, and I just wanted to share maybe a few updates about where we are as an organization. So many of you here would have heard of us, some may not. We are the Global Antibiotic R&D Partnership. We're a non-profit foundation based here in Switzerland. We were actually founded by WHO and the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. And over the last year since our foundation, we have really strived to build a pipeline of projects focusing on, particularly on maternal newborn child health, so neonatal sepsis, pediatric antimicrobial drug development, but also focus on other areas increasingly now, what we call serious bacterial infections, which are more kind of hospital-associated infections, particularly focusing on gram-negative infections, and of course also sexually transmitted infections, which was a program that was actually kind of requested by WHO, who are very concerned about MDR, or multi-drug resistant gonorrhea. So we have built a kind of pipeline of projects with our partners. We both work exclusively in a partnership model with biotech and pharma companies, and also with non-profits and academic organizations, and also obviously countries, which are really key, particularly when we come to looking at doing clinical trials at country level, and also looking at access. So to date, we do have several projects in the pipeline, but I just wanted to kind of mention a few key milestones for this last 12 months. So we've launched now a novel clinical trial to develop antibiotic combinations for newborn sepsis. There's two phases to this project. The first phase has started in South Africa and Kenya, and globally this will be expanded to several sites in several countries to aim to recruit about 3,000 newborns overall. One of the aspects we decided in this particular project to start with is to really look at repurposing of older antibiotics, and we did quite a lot of years of background work, both preclinical and clinical studies, to identify combinations of antibiotics, really to look at alternative empiric treatments for neonatal sepsis to replace or provide an alternative to the standard of care. So that's kicked off, and it's a very big and important trial, something that will take a few years to do, but we're very, I think feel this is a very important moment in really addressing this neglected population within a neglected area. And I think everyone recognizes that the neonatal population in particular is probably the key high burden population in AMR. For sexually transmitted infections, we have just completed recruitment of a global phase 3 trial of a drug called zoliflodacin, a novel oral treatment for gonorrhea. This trial was undertaken in 16 sites, 5 countries, nearly 1,000 patients recruited. We believe it's the largest clinical trial for gonorrhea that's ever been undertaken. And it was not an easy task because this was done during the pandemic with a whole host of problems that was opened up because of that. But I think I'd really like to commend our team in GARDP and our partners on the ground, and our partners obviously in Taser Therapeutics, who were involved in this development program. But this is something that we were really driving and leading. And in parallel to that was a pharmaceutical development project with a partner in India to really look at a low-cost commercial formulation for globally. We've also, in the last year, I think this is probably a little bit older news, but we have now also supported a company to develop a drug in phase 3 called cefepime taniborbactam. This is also being supported by BARDA and the AMR Action Fund, and the good news is that this trial has now been completed successfully, and filing will be happening for this compound, we hope, in the near future. So that's also very positive news in the development of new improved treatments. And last but not least, moving from the research and development, really the clinical development portfolio of GARDP to access. This is an area that GARDP has started to work on more recently as our portfolio is maturing. And we've recently, last year, we signed a license and collaboration agreement with Shionogi and a collaboration agreement with the Clinton Health Access Initiative to really expand access to cefiderocol, which is a recently approved antibiotic in 135 countries to treat serious bacterial infections. And this project is now ongoing. There are several phases involved in it, but first and foremost, really identifying a second source of manufacturing and supply for global health needs, and this is something that is progressing well. And last but not least, and this is something that we are extremely thrilled about, and some have to say I'm somewhat relieved as well. But we will be launching a partnership with the Global Drug Facility. Some of you may know that GDF, as it's commonly called, is a non-profit partnership that's really focusing on access to TB medicines. So we are really like to announce today a groundbreaking partnership between GARDP and GDF with the aim of enhancing antibiotic access in low and middle income countries. And we believe this is important. We are combining GARDP's expertise in the R&D early access phase and GDF's kind of proven track record in market shaping and procurement. And the aim is to really ensure sustainable and affordable access to life-saving antibiotics. And this is obviously something that's going to be incredibly important for some of the drugs that I've mentioned here as they come through clinical development and into access. And we are actually very grateful to GDF for really kind of agreeing to take on a role here, and we're very excited to work with them in the future going forward. So I'll stop there and hand
Well,
it back
I
to you,
think,
Hilary.
yes, we got have a few questions on access, certainly, because that is the red thread, isn't it, that runs through all your work. Picking up on something, Ali, that you said about incentivizing development, because I think this report to the G7 health ministers, it talks about this push and pull model, and that the push model is insufficient. So just a few words about what are the challenges there?
Sure, yes. So the G7 progress report really reports on the progress of the G7 towards incentivizing R&D, and there we speak to some of the progress that's been made in continuing to fund push incentives, which are the incentives that reduce the actual cost of R&D, so GARDP being a good example, CarbX and others, but also on pull incentives, which are more pulling the products through the pipeline by rewarding R&D and innovation through different types of incentives. And the so-called Netflix model or the subscription model is one that people are most familiar with. And I think the conclusion of the report, not to be good news, bad news, but it is good news and bad news. There is progress. There is renewed funding for push incentives. There's a host of new pull incentives that are either being expanded, under consideration, or being piloted, or being actively explored, depending on the country. But all of it together is still insufficient to actually drive the R&D investments that we need to see the type of pipeline that we need. So I think that the report shows some of the positive trends and the progress, but we need to do a lot more.
Hilary, in the UK, they've been piloting, haven't they, this Netflix subscription model. Do you know how it's going?
Well, I mean, Dame Sally Davis, I think, made this part of her life's work, really, and it came out of the time when she was Chief Medical Officer. As far as I'm aware, it's going quite well, but this takes a long time. You know, but at least the government are now putting some money behind the idea of protecting antibiotics rather than as paying for use, which clearly doesn't work in this particular scenario.
Yeah, and developers need certainty, don't they? And that's what it gives them, absolutely. Access, the access challenge, how big is it, Ali? And why is it so difficult to get, well, new and existing antibiotics to these low and middle income countries?
Sure, yeah, I don't have an exact number for you to actually measure the magnitude of the problem, because it is so big, but I think that many people understand that in low and middle income countries there are major problems accessing not only new antibiotics but also existing older generic cheap ones as well. But there are also, these are problems that touch high income countries as well. And we see issues of shortages of older existing products, especially as the return on investment becomes so thin that suppliers exit the market, and that can create a shortage. So it's a problem that affects different types of products and different types of countries, and so it's really one that affects everybody, I would say.
Manica, you had on the screen, there we are, you've got this Shionogi and Chai, this partnership. It was a first of its kind partnership. How's it working, and when are you actually going to get, now I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to pronounce the name, Cefidericol, to the countries? How's it going?
Yeah, this was a partnership that was launched about the middle of last year, and we're actually very very pleased to have been able to launch this with Shionogi, and then Chai also coming on board to really look at some of the practical aspects of how we can look at unpacking kind of an access strategy for kind of global health, and particularly for a large number of countries. And it is a bit unusual. This has kind of been done before in many areas, but in the antibiotic space, it's not usual, I should say, not including TB, of course. And so that's why I think that we've really developed kind of several different aspects of work that we need to look at. One, starting with, in fact, a supply of the drug for the 135 countries, and possibly more, depending on also Shionogi's needs for its market as well. but also then looking at other aspects that we would need to think about. How do we start the dialogue in countries? How do we look at guidance for use, looking at the kind of information that will need to be generated at country level, looking at a regulatory strategy, looking for partners, particularly in the private sector, so a manufacturing partner, and then looking at licensees, sub-licensees for commercialization. So those are steps that will follow. But we also do want to start looking at a network of sites that can be involved in helping to roll out this kind of treatment in a first phase, that can really look at a way of doing this in a responsible way.
And have you got some candidate countries in mind?
Yes, we do. And I think that my colleague here, Jennifer, I'm going to pass that on to her later. So please talk to Jennifer in the back, who will be very happy to kind of take on, explain more detail what we're doing on the project. But it is a very important, project for us. And in a way, it's a pathfinder for access to new and particularly reserve antibiotics. That's the way we see it. And it's one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of take on this kind of challenge and responsibility. I would say that it is very important to think about the issue about the push and pull incentives, because there needs to be a sustainable ecosystem in both the public and private sector for the development and rollout of these antibiotics. But I also think we need to have a much bigger discussion about access, because it's a little bit kind of the forgotten issue, often tagged on into this discussion. There are often some good intentions when people discuss this, but when you look at the kind of concrete aspects and you look at where's the money behind this, that's a gap. And I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And what we're trying to do is highlight that it is possible to do
like
things.
the Shinogi is a sort of pathfinder.
It is possible to do this. It is possible to bring actors together and to work together to solve some of these challenges in access. And these represent opportunities, and they shouldn't be seen as threats or risks, et cetera, et cetera. I would also second what Ali said. I think we really have to think about access globally. And I just want to kind of mention an anecdotal story that, about a month ago, my daughter was sick. She had an infection. I had to take her to the hospital. Thankfully, it wasn't life-threatening, but she required antibiotics. I was given a prescription, and there was a stock out of this antibiotic. And this is in Switzerland. And this is of an access antibiotic. And I think, of course, it's a shock when you live in Switzerland. You think, okay, they can get the drugs here. But that is not the case, and I think there are many dimensions that are dysfunctional in the antibiotic space. And this can be with high volume old generic antibiotics, it can be with low volume reserve antibiotics and low margin antibiotics. And each of these will require different solutions. But I think there really needs to be much more focus to solve this issue, because you need to have an integrated approach on how you deploy a portfolio of antibiotics, whether they're access, watch, or reserve. And that's why I also commend the work WHO did to even develop this concept and really start thinking about antibiotics as a kind of strategic portfolio to be deployed in health systems for healthcare and for improving lives worldwide. But I still think we have a long way to go here.
Yeah, obviously. Let me go to the audience, and you mentioned Jennifer on the Shinogi deal, but if you have any questions for Hilary, Ali, or Manica, a mic will come round. In fact, Dominique most probably will come round with the mic. If you've got any thoughts, particularly on that last point that Manica has just made, how do we have this integrated approach? Because just listening to the Shinogi, you can see all of the steps that have to be done, as well as the manufacturing, the regulatory, everything that has to be in place to get these antibiotics in. So any question, please feel free. And if you'd like to say your name and who you would like to answer your question, that always makes things run smoother.
Thanks. My name is Maureen Birmingham. I'm working as a WHO representative in the country of Haiti. And just a question about, the great work you're doing, but something that pops into my mind during the whole presentation was, what about the agricultural side? What about the animal health side and the agricultural side? Whether you're stepping into that space and in terms of their work in the same area, and of course the use issues in the area, and and how that interacts with what you're doing. I'm just wondering if you're in that space or it's completely separate. Thanks.
I'll maybe let Ali respond to that. I can just explain what our approach is. I mean, we're a very small organization with a small budget, so I just want to make that really clear to everybody that with the resources that we have to focus on what we need to do. And you know, of course, we have a charter that is broad, but the decision in our board at the beginning when we set up GARDP was to focus on therapeutics, on small molecules in particular, on antimicrobial, antibiotics, gram-negative bacteria and STIs, and that's where we are. And actually just doing all of that already is a huge amount of work. We have thought about some of these aspects, and to give an example, you know, when we've made a licensing agreement and partnership with one of the biotechs that we partnered with, which was a clinical development program which we've invested a lot of money in and taken a very active role in the development, we did put some thinking into what kind of things we could at least be more forward-looking on. And use purely for human use was one of the issues, and even within human use looking at a specific indication or indications of use. And that's at least something that we can think about proactively in advance to kind of say, okay, we are developing a new class of antibiotics, and we should be thinking in a forward-looking way things that would probably be acceptable to our private sector partners, but put it on the table at the beginning and have that discussion. So that is something we've done. I think probably Ali would be in a better position to respond more on the animal health side.
Sure, yeah, I mean, happy to. In general, WHO takes a One Health approach to AMR, as you probably know, and is working with the quadripartite UN agencies, health, WHO, food, animal, and environment on AMR issues. But one of the documents that is coming soon, probably in July sort of timeline, is the next edition of the critically important antimicrobials list. It's now called the medically important antimicrobials list, the MIA. And this is really a risk management tool aimed at regulators, but also other key audiences that are looking at antibiotic use in especially the animal health sector, and looking at where there are classes of antibiotics that are used in both humans and animals, which ones that are at the highest risk and need to be the most protected. So I think that that's an important resource that will be coming soon in its latest edition. It's been published already 6 times, so this will be the 7th edition, but working on the implementation of that report, and not just having a report that sits on a shelf, but actually the adoption of the recommendations is going to be a top priority, I think, going forward.
And Hilary, you'd like to say something too.
It's a minor comment, but when we did when we did the work for Jim O'Neill on the impact on global GDP, we looked at a whole series of scenarios. One of which was, if you go to a country where the use of antibiotics in say poultry, or in any any animals, is then getting into the sort of human food chain as well, you might choose not to go and go there, because actually you might end up with an antimicrobial resistant infection because you picked it up somewhere. So a kind of push and pull, if you like, for governments to start to be more responsible. And if you just look at people, I think some of the things that happen as AMR becomes more common, or if it becomes more common, is people will have to make choices. You'll make a choice between adjuvant chemotherapy and the life-threatening risk of of an infection that you can't treat, or a hip replacement, because if that hip becomes infected, actually that person's quality of life will probably be even worse than living with an arthritic hip for the rest of their lives. So I think looking at it at a kind of clinical level, the widespread use of antibiotics where they're not essential is really quite scary.
Yeah. There's antibiotics in food too, isn't there, which is yet another whole area. Yes, more questions. Yes, please, the lady in front.
Thank you. Iana Daneva, Global Health Consultant. So my question is with regards to gender and how you incorporate gender in your health research, in particular the studies you mentioned on STIs and serious bacterial infection. As we know, women are at higher risk for some STIs, and also with regards to access. Thank you.
Manica, please.
Yes, I think it's a very pertinent question, and I think this was actually one of the most complicated aspects in the phase 3 trial, pivotal trial we did for zoliflodacin. And we could have done things a lot easier, if I can put it this way, and just gone to kind of recruit in well-known sites and, get a population that is kind of more well-studied. But we wanted to get a more diverse population, and particularly to evaluate the drug in a female population in different parts of the world. And that arguably has made the whole experience more costly and more expensive. But we have to put this priority population up front in the development program, and I'm very proud that we did that. And you can make policies about things like this, but the only way you really deliver is by actually doing it in practice and generating the information that is valid and useful and applicable in the populations that really need it the most. And similarly, doing neonatal sepsis, for me, the whole maternal child health space is woefully neglected in this area. And when I first started working in GARDP in 2016, I was lucky because I was working under someone, Bernard Pukul, who was very encouraging for us to take risks. And I went to see someone from a well-known organization who basically said, why are you doing neonatal sepsis? It's the hardest thing to start with, which was kind of, well, that's the whole point of it, right? Because it's a priority population, and because it's difficult and nobody's doing it, and that's why we do it as a non-profit. And we are working, there are actually people who are doing it, and we're working with them. But it is a challenge, and you do have to work very closely, for instance, with, not just, obviously it's a complicated population. You have to work with the caregivers, and you have to work with the care, and particularly the parents, which is also another added dimension. How do you actually conduct and do this kind of research, and the ethics associated with it? And it's still something we have to pay a lot of attention to.
Thanks for that question. Other questions in the audience? Yes, the lady here, and then I'm not sure whether a hand went up somewhere else, but here, yes.
Hi, I'm Hilary Thomas. I work for React. A question for Manica. Could you expand a little bit more on the GDF partnership? Congratulations on getting that. But just expand on how will it work? Will it cover all the different antibiotics that you're developing in GARDP, or how are you seeing it?
Yeah. So the quick answer is talk to Jennifer, but I will try to answer this question. So it's a good one. I mean, we're very, this is something we've obviously been discussing and working with our colleagues in GDF for a while, because we felt the model that GDF has in TB has got something to offer in this space in terms of enhancing access. And from our perspective, we can't do everything ourselves, and we need to bring in other actors who have more experience, more skills and resources to help solve this kind of access crisis that we have in this space. And so this is the whole point. GDF has this huge market shaping experience over the last decade plus in its work. It does offer very concrete procurement services, how to look at consolidating demand, making some rationality into a market that is already quite problematic. And GDF has donors and resources behind the work that it does. So clearly that is something that they've had to ensure to get buy-in on. But we hope that we can now collaborate with them on some of the products in our portfolio that's coming through in order to deliver this for patients, to make it really meaningful. And so we feel that GDF has an important role to play from the global health perspective. We are now getting into the specifics of one or two of the individual projects that we can start piloting and working on. But the first step was really to get this kind of approval for GDF to start looking and working in this space. So I think for me that's very positive.
Mm-hmm. If Jennifer would like to say anything more, a microphone could go round, or otherwise you can find her during the networking cocktail, which is approaching.
No, I don't think I have much more to add to what Manica said, but I think that what Manica mentioned around building this ecosystem for AMR is going to be incredibly important. So GARDP and the work on AMR, unlike in many other disease areas, we're in a place where we don't have a large donor, we don't have a major program to really consolidate and support the market. And so what we have to do is really work with partners who are experts, both local, regional, and international partners, to make sure that the products, as Manica said, are getting to the patients who need them most. And then I just wanted to make one other comment about the access gap. I think we don't know what the access gap is, and that in itself is shocking. We've done a very brief back-of-the-envelope estimate of need for carbapenem-resistant treatment, or one type of very resistant bacterial treatment in South Asia. And what we think we saw is that there's about 1.4 million people who are having carbapenem-resistant serious bacterial infections in 2019. About 40,000 treatments were procured. That is a massive gap. That cascade terrifies me. So I think there's just huge work to be done. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there another question that somebody is burning to ask? Otherwise, I'll do that moderator's thing, which was inspired by this, because there was, well, what have we done in the last year? I think the milestones are all up there. So let me just ask our speakers, World Health Assembly next year, what was the one thing that you would like to see that's advanced in this sphere?
I'd like to hear that Jennifer's gap was closed.
Okay, we'll write that one down for May 2024.
Yeah, I mean, not specific to the World Health Assembly, but I think in terms of political processes in general and working up to the UNGA high-level meeting as well in 2024, having strong commitments and targets around not only the pipeline, but also on the access side is something that is really important. And I think I would also add getting AMR more front and center in some of the pandemic accord documentation and treaties and so on as well would be an enabler that would help us a lot.
Yes, I'm sure everybody is watching that accord and the negotiations that are going on at the moment. Manica, one thing.
Maybe I'll just make a more general statement, which is, for me, success is not about, finishing a trial or filing it with a regulatory authority, or us getting more money, or there being more push or pull incentives. It is about getting treatments to patients and this happening sustainably. And what I would like us to see, in at least what we're doing in GARDP, is I want to see these treatments get to people who need it. And that, to me, is what drives the organization and what I see as ultimately a success, and what I hope to be able to come back here and say, okay, remember we finished that trial? Patients are getting it who need it somewhere in the world, and that would be the start of success.
Well, thank you very, very much. And do tweet some of those comments using that new hashtag of Power of Antibiotics. Go onto the campaign page too, because yes, it's a silent pandemic that needs to have a voice, unfortunately. Thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you, Hilary, very much for sharing your story and your knowledge, and Ali giving the WHO perspective, and of course GARDP. And GARDP are now going to invite you to a networking cocktail, which I believe is over there and not in the garden. So any more questions that you've got, our experts are here, but there's also experts in the room. So thank you very much.